Thank you everyone who's joining us on Zoom. We are going live on Facebook as well as I speak. All right, Rabbi Silber, just because it's the top of the hour, let me just give a brief introduction. Thank you everyone who's joining today, whether you're joining in the morning or in the afternoon. This class is the Shabbat prayers with Rabbi David Silber, where we will analyze an analysis of prayers that are unique to Shabbat and how they provide insight into the special character of this holy day. Just as a point of housekeeping, I strongly encourage people to take the promotion to panelists. That way you can be seen, and ask questions a bit easier. And another point of housekeeping is if you are not actively asking questions, please mute yourself. Otherwise we get some weird audio issues and cross sound. If you have your own Sefer Tehillim that you prefer, please open it up to Psalm 95. And if not, but you can also follow along on screen. Links to Sefaria will be posted in chat. And if you have questions during class, feel free to ask them in chat, raise your hand, wait for a pause. And with that, and it's a pleasure to learn today with Rabbi Silber, who I believe needs no introduction.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the topic is the prayers of Shabbat. I don't know if we'll cover all the prayers of Shabbat. We had, some of us have studied together the regular weekday prayers with a focus on the blessings of Shema, the Shemona Esrei, Psukei de Zimra. To some extent, the prayers of Shabbat, the fundamental structure of the Shabbat prayers, is basically the same as the weekday prayers. At its center, it's always about the reading of the Shema morning and evening. It's about the silent prayer, the Amidah, which follows. Of course, as we'll see, obviously the text is different, the number of blessings is different, but the overall structure is pretty much the same. It's interesting, by the way, that when you open up a siddur, it's very striking. You open up a siddur, any normal siddur, I would say, I've never seen otherwise. You open up the siddur, the daily service, and when you open it up, it begins. The first thing you find in the siddur is the morning service, Shacharit, Adon Olam, Matovu Olecha Yaakov, etc., various blessings. In other words, the daily prayer book begins with the morning prayer. And the next thing after that is typically the afternoon prayer, the Mincha prayer. And then we have the evening prayer. So it's morning, afternoon, and evening. That is true of virtually every siddur I've ever seen. It's not true, though, of Shabbat. When you open the prayer book of the Shabbat prayers, the first thing you encounter is the evening service, and then the morning service, and then the afternoon service. And that is reflective, actually. It's actually, I think, a rather interesting point, that the day of prayer, fundamentally, the day of prayer starts in the morning. And the reason for that is that, among other things, the day in the temple started in the morning. The day in the Beit HaMikdash starts in the morning. The morning, the Tamid Shel Shachar, the morning sacrifice, and then you move to the evening and to the afternoon. And then the evening service is a residue, one might say, a remnant of the morning and afternoon services, the two daily sacrifices, morning, afternoon. The fats of those sacrifices, or the emurim, they were burnt all night. So the night is a culmination of the day of service in the temple. And that's the remnants of daily sacrifices are brought at night. And the Gemara claims that the order of the prayer service is based on the sacrificial service, which is why there is a view in the Talmud that the evening service is actually only voluntary. It's a reshut. One need not pray. The morning, afternoon are obligatory, certainly rabbinically obligatory. The rabbis obligate us to pray morning and afternoon, but the evening service is a dispute as to whether there is actually an obligation to pray in the evening, or if you wish to do so, you may do so. But that's the dispute. And the reason for that is because since it's based on the sacrificial service, And the sacrifices are brought in the morning and the afternoon. There is no evening sacrifice. Since there's no evening sacrifice, there is perhaps no prayer, no obligatory prayer in the evening. That is one point of view, and it's actually a fairly accepted point of view, except for the fact that the claims that the Jewish people, despite the fact that we are not obligated to pray at night, the Jewish people have decided to accept upon themselves the evening service. So that's why you open up a siddur, and the first thing you encounter is the morning service. Makes complete sense. But when you open up the Shabbat siddur, it never starts with the morning. It always starts with the evening. And the reason for that, of course, is that the Shabbat begins in the evening. The holy day, the Jewish day, but certainly the holy Jewish day, starts in the evening. And in fact, the Torah pretty much in one place makes reference to that when the Torah speaks of Yom Kippur. The Torah says, "Me erev ad erev," from even to even, from evening to evening. The holy day of Yom Kippur starts in the evening and concludes in the evening. So that's true not just of Yom Kippur, that's true of all the holy days. Shabbat is a holy day, the holiest day. So of course, when you open up the Shabbat prayer book, you always start with the evening prayer. Okay, now, I said before in the brief introduction that the fundamental Shabbat service, the structure of the Shabbat service, is fundamentally no different than the daily service. Now, that is true, but there are, of course, a couple of exceptions. One exception, which is not unique to Shabbat, but is common to all the holy days, and even common to a day that's not a holy day, is that on certain days of the year, there is an additional service. Apart from the three services, morning, afternoon, evening, there is an additional service. We call that the Musaf. And the Musaf service is present whenever there was an additional sacrifice on that day. Again, the connection of prayer and sacrifices is very deep. Certain days of the year, there was an additional sacrifice. Most of those are what we would call holy days. There's one day where there's a Musaf sacrifice, which is not a holy day, which is Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. But on those days, Rosh Chodesh and all the holy days, Shabbat, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, there is the additional Musaf service. That's not unique to Shabbat. That's common to all the holy days. Now, what is unique to Shabbat? Well, of course, we'll see, but there's one thing that's very unique to Shabbat and very interesting. In addition to the normal services that we have on Shabbat, and that, of course, well known to all of us, is the service is known as Kabbalat Shabbat, the acceptance of Shabbat. There is the Kabbalat Shabbat service with which we begin the service of Shabbat. So it's not the evening service. The evening service, Ma'ariv, which is common to all days, there's always an evening service, the Shema and the Amidah. But on Shabbat, there is something called Kabbalat Shabbat. So this afternoon, morning for you actually, afternoon for me here in Jerusalem, I wanted to discuss with you this service known as Kabbalat Shabbat. And I will pause periodically to take comments or questions. So first, let me say that in terms of Kabbalat Shabbat, so the Kabbalat Shabbat service that's known to us is fundamentally a function of the mystics of the 16th century. The mystics in the town of Tzfat, there were a group of very important Mekubalim, important mystics, and they're the ones who actually developed in different ways the service we know as Kabbalat Shabbat. So let me just say at the outset that there is more than one form that the Kabbalat Shabbat service takes. There are many. Many of us, probably certain Ashkenazim, are used to the following Kabbalat Shabbat service. It begins with 5 Psalms, L'chun Ranana being the first one, which is Psalm number 95, then 96, 97, 98, 99. Those are 5. Followed by Psalm number 29, Mizmor David, Havul Hashem B'nei Elim. After which some people say a little prayer called Ana B'Koach, which is in some Sidurim and not in others. And then famously the poem L'cha Dodi, typically sung. And after L'cha Dodi, 2 more Psalms. One is Mizmor Shir V'Yom HaShabbat. I believe that's Psalm number 92. And then Psalm 93, Hashem Malach Geut Lavesh, Lavesh Hashem Otis Itazar. That fundamentally is, I think, the Kabbalat service, Kabbalat Shabbat service, that is known to many of us. However, that's one form of the service. It turns out, actually, it's good to know this, that there are many Jews who have a different Kabbalat Shabbat. For example, I discovered this only a few years ago. There is a practice among many Sephardic Jews that they start again with Psalm 95, L'chun Ranana, and we'll look at these Psalms in a few minutes. And they do Psalm 95 and Psalm 96 and Psalm 97, Psalm 98, Psalm 99, and Psalm 100. Till a few years ago, I didn't know that. And most recently, and I discovered it a few years ago, and most recently, when I come to a synagogue and they have different prayer books, I always open up the prayer books to see because they're different. I mean, many are different. And I've come across many prayer books lately, which have these 6 Psalms, 95 through 100 inclusive. The Ashkenazim they only have 5. And the 6th Psalm, which is also, I think, recited by the other practice, is Psalm number 29, Havul Hashem B'nei Elim. And at the end, after L'cha Dodi, Mizmor Shir V'Yom HaShabbat. That's another custom, the 6 Psalms. Then, most recently in Israel, when I went to pray in a Friday night, there's a little Moroccan synagogue on my brother's block. Actually, there are 2 of them, the big one and the little one. So they start with Mizmor David, Psalm number 29. They don't say L'chun Ranana. They don't say any of those Psalms. They start with Mizmor David. They say L'cha Dodi. And I don't remember if they then say Mizmor Shir V'Yom HaShabbat. And then, prior to Mizmor Shir, or just after, they recite Shir HaShirim. But there's no L'chun Ranana. None of those Psalms are recited. And then there is another custom. Not to say 95, 96, 97, 98, and to start with Psalm 99. In short, this itself is an important point. There are many customs. The Ari, the great Kabbalist, had a different practice. He said Mizmor Shir, Havul Hashem B'nei Elim, Psalm 29, L'cha Dodi, and Mizmor Shir V'Yom HaShabbat, and that was it. He didn't say the Psalms either. So there are many, many practices. So what I thought would be a useful thing to do for us would be to take a look at the 6 Psalms. That is to say, not the practice that most of us are used to. 95, L'chun Ranana, which we are used to, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, and Psalm 100, which is very striking. Now, the practice we have is not to say Psalm 100, but we do say Psalm 29. And here I want to make the first observation about this Kabbalat Shabbat. The Kabbalat Shabbat, in some form, existed before the mystics of Tzfat, but it was very abbreviated. They would say Mizmor Shir V'Yom HaShabbat. That's an ancient practice. But the addition of all of these Psalms, that was the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists have affected our davening very much, but this is really a whole new service. It's very unusual. And the first point to be made over here is that the Kabbalat Shabbat service in one form or another seems to include 6 Psalms. We have 95 through 99 inclusive and 29. Others have the 6 Psalms of 95 through 100, which I'll come back to. But the idea of reciting 6 Psalms is not accidental. Those who put into practice such a custom understood that the recitation of 6 Psalms exists in 2 different places apart from Kabbalat Shabbat. One is in the daily service, it's called Psuke de Zimra, the recitation of verses before we say the Shema and the blessings of the Shema. The practice is, and every sitter has this, is to read the last 6 Psalms. Psalm 145 through 150 inclusive. Psalm 145 begins with the words Tila David. We read the last verses of Psalm 144, known to most of us, no doubt, which starts with the verse Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Od Yalucha Sela. That's the end of Psalm 144, for whatever reason. Then we jump into Tila David, and from there to the end of the book of Psalms is 6 Psalms. That's one practice of reading 6 Psalms. Then there's another practice to read 6 Psalms, which is Psalm 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, and 118. Also 6 Psalms. What is that?
Hallel.
That's Hallel. That's the Hallel. So Psuke de Zimra, by the way, is also called Hallel. The Gemara referred to Psuke de Zimra as Hallel. The Gemara, famous Gemara says, there was a statement made by one of the Amoraim, whoever says Hallel in every day is a blasphemer, blasphemes God's name. What are you talking about? But Yochanan said, whoever says Hallel every day is worthy of the world to come. Says the Gemara, he was referring to Psuke de Zimra. Psuke de Zimra, the 6 Psalms of Psuke de Zimra, that's a wonderful thing. But if you say the great Hallel, the Egyptian Hallel, the Hallel HaMitzri, that's very bad. Presumably because one focuses on the big miracles, and the other one focuses on more of the routines of life. The routines of life is good to say Hallel every day, but to focus on the miracles is a misfocus, because the claim is that God's only present at moments of great miracles, whereas the prayer service presupposes God's presence all the time. So in any event, my point is, point number 1, the Kabbalists who created this thing we call Kabbalat Shabbat, typically at its core, there were 6 Psalms. Either the 6 Psalms of 95 through 100, and we'll talk about that today shortly, or our practice of the 5 Psalms plus the 6th Psalm of Psalm 29, and then the 7th Psalm after L'cha Dodi is Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat. So the 6 Psalms relate to the 6 days of the week, presumably, and the 7th Psalm, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, is a reference to the Shabbat. Okay, that's point number 1. Now let me make point number 2 here, and then I'll stop for a moment before we jump into L'chut Radana. And that is just to reflect on this idea of Kabbalat Shabbat in general. What is the idea of Kabbalat Shabbat? So I wanted to make 2 suggestions. We do not have, although it does appear from certain Geniza fragments, that there was something said upon the introduction of the festivals as well. But de facto, when the mystics created Kabbalat Shabbat, they didn't create Kabbalat Yom Tov. So we have this service we call Kabbalat Shabbat, and they specifically focused on Shabbat, but the festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, etc., we don't have anything Kabbalat HaPesach or Kabbalat Shavuot. It's specifically Shabbat. Now, what is the idea in general about Kabbalat Shabbat? What do the mystics have in mind? So first of all, the mystics played off what it says in the Talmud. The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat talks about certain people that as Shabbat was approaching would walk out into the fields. And they'd walk out of the town into the fields, and they would say, Boi Kala, something along those lines. They would greet the Sabbath, according to one text, the Sabbath king. according to a different text, the Sabbath queen. They would go out into the field. They would leave their place, go out into the fields, walk through the door, and they would greet the Sabbath. So Kabbalat Shabbat is playing off the idea of greeting the Sabbath, and actually that's why there is the custom when we sing L'cha Dodi, which we'll get to next week. When we sing L'cha Dodi, there is a practice that as we finish it, we turn around and face the open door. We don't actually walk out the door, but we face the open door as if we are greeting the Sabbath queen who comes in. So that's the idea of Kabbalat Shabbat. And the mystics of Tzfat, actually we walk out. We walk out into the field, walk out of the door to greet the Sabbath. We don't walk out of the door, but we do is ceremonially greet the Sabbath. So what is the idea of Kabbalat Shabbat? How do we understand this idea of Kabbalat Shabbat? So let me make two suggestions about Kabbalat Shabbat. What has to do with acceptance? The word kabel is to accept. And the parallel to Kabbalat Shabbat, and the verse that comes to mind, especially in those mystics who walk out into the field, walk out the door, and greet the Sabbath queen, is the verse that the Torah says about the receiving of the Torah. Vayotze Moshe et ha'am v'krat Elohim min ha'machaneh. That Moses took the people, he took them out to greet God. So the idea of Kabbalat Shabbat is that Shabbat is coming. Shabbat is coming whether we accept it or not. Every seventh day is Shabbat. We don't create the Shabbat in that sense. It's always here. But just as we accepted the Torah, and by accepting it, if someone important comes to town, sometimes people go to greet the person, they walk out. It's a way of demonstrating our respect. So Kabbalat Shabbat can be understood in the same way. The same way is Kabbalat Torah, that we are agreeing, accepting, we gladly demonstrates our acceptance of what's there. We're happy to accept it. And we demonstrate that by walking out and greeting the Sabbath. That's one idea. And as I said, the mystics would actually walk out and greet the Sabbath. That's one idea. But there is another idea, which I think is a very interesting idea about Kabbalat Shabbat in general, and that's the following idea. Unlike the festivals, because the festivals, the Talmud says, can fall on one of 2 days. Let's say the festival of Sukkot, of Pesach, Chag HaMatzot is the 15th day. Sukkot is the 15th day of the month, the full moon. And the 15th day of the month, but what day is the first day of the month? The first day of the month in Jewish tradition can be one of 2 days. The court decides which day it is. So in effect, the court decides which day the festival is. And as reflective of that, the blessing that's said on the festival is Baruch Atah Hashem, Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. Blessed are you, O God, who sanctified Israel and the appointed times. We mention Israel. But our text on Shabbat is not Mikadesh Yisrael v'Shabbat. That text did exist, by the way, but it's not the text we say today. What we say is Baruch Atah Hashem Mikadesh HaShabbat, because it's not up to us. The Shabbat is every seventh day, whether we have no role in that. It's automatic. So Shabbat is always there. So the question is there any human input in terms of the sanctification of the Shabbat? Is there a human dimension or not? And the idea of Kabbalat HaShabbat, perhaps, is not just about greeting the Sabbath, honoring the Sabbath, demonstrating our desire for a love of the Sabbath, but maybe it's also a way to suggest that we are part and parcel of actually declaring the Sabbath. It's a very interesting thing to think about. Is there a human dimension? Because there is an interesting halacha, striking halacha, when it comes to Shabbat. When does Shabbat begin? So Shabbat begins when the sun sets, basically. However, there is a halacha that one can add on to the Shabbos. One can start Shabbos early. Of course, one could ask the question, what do you mean start Shabbos early? It's Friday. It's not Shabbos. Call it whatever you want, but it's Friday. No. We have the ability, Mosifim Mechol ala Kodesh. We have the ability to extend the Shabbat even into the previous day to a certain degree. Can't start in the morning, but to a certain extent, one can extend it. So there is perhaps, that halacha itself suggests maybe that there is a human dimension to the Shabbat as well. It's not just about accepting it or greeting it, but maybe the very walking out is a way of saying that we are part and parcel of declaring the day Shabbat. So that actually, I think, is an interesting idea, very fascinating idea of the possibility of the human being sanctifying time, even though it's not actually Shabbat. When it comes to the festivals, it's certainly the case because the court determines what day is the first day of the month. So in effect, they're declaring this day to be a sacred day and not that day. When it comes to Shabbat, even the Shabbat itself, it's holy whether you sanctify it or not. But potentially one could say that the human being has the ability to add sanctity. Perhaps that's the idea of making Kiddush. Is Kiddush simply a reflection it is Shabbat? Or is Kiddush a way of sanctifying the day itself, of adding a human dimension to the sanctity of Shabbat? So perhaps the reason of Kabbalat Shabbat interested the mystics, perhaps, more than the festivals, because the festivals, we know there's a human dimension. But when it comes to the Shabbat, one might think there's no human element to the Shabbat, and perhaps one can understand the whole idea of Kabbalat Shabbat as underscoring the human dimension. I say perhaps. In any event, what we have before us is a new service. It's a new service called Kabbalat Shabbat, and you can only imagine, I'm sure you realize this, that when people do new things, there's always a question about it, and some people will say we don't accept it. And that was also true of the Kabbalat Shabbat. Yes, the great mystics inaugurated it and created it, one might say, but there still were reservations about it, which is why in many synagogues, it's interesting that when the Chazan reads Kabbalat Shabbat, the Chazan reads Kabbalat Shabbat from the same place they read the Torah. When the Chazan reads the evening service, the Chazan goes off the central place and walks to the front and reads from the place that the Chazan reads the other services. And that difference, that distinction is a way of underscoring, as it were, that the Kabbalat Shabbat service is an add-on. It's not really part of the davening. It's just an add-on. Be that as it may, that maybe from a certain technical standpoint, from a legal halachic standpoint, that's true. But from the standpoint of the Jewish people, it's fair to say that the Jewish people have accepted Kabbalat Shabbat, and probably for many, it's the service they like the best of all. Especially the Chadodi and the singing and all that. So it is a beloved service, and it is unique to Shabbat. So that's a good place to start. And it's also recited in the very beginning of Shabbat. Let me just pause here for a moment. If there are any comments or questions about what I've said so far, I'll be happy to hear. And then we will afterwards begin with reflections on the Psalms, the L'chun Ranna, and some interesting points about these Psalms. Is there anything in the chat, or people speak up? More than welcome.
No, it's been quiet in the chat.
David, I
Yes.
was thinking with what you were saying that as opposed to Yom Tov, that we clearly are the ones, the arbiters of when it is. Shabbat is totally from God, and we have no input into that. Considering that we just changed the clock,
Right.
it's slightly ironic that it does
Right.
change, to some degree.
For sure. And the truth of the matter is, it's also very interesting that according to the Talmud, in Rashi, the first Rashi in Chumash quotes it, the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, according to the Talmud, the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, was the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem.
Chodesh Hazeh Lachem. Right.
Right, because actually slaves don't control their own time. So if you're a slave, you're working on someone else's clock, as we would say, whatever the boss says. But as a free person, time is ours to use as we desire. And when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, and this is very powerful in the Talmud, that as I mentioned before, that the court determines what day is Rosh Chodesh, and sort of God goes along with it. So, it is the first mitzvah, the approach to time, the degree to which time is malleable, we can shape the time. Free people have time on their hands, it's their time. So that is extremely significant in terms of how we see the human dimension when it comes to our practices, halacha, etc. To what degree people we have freedom to and license to manipulate time. That is I think a very interesting question. Okay, is there anybody else?
Susan.
Yes.
Yes. What you just said about the Chazan leading Kabbalat Shabbat from the place where we read the Torah, could that be connected to the idea that you just gave of connecting Kabbalat Shabbat to Kabbalat HaTorah?
It's totally possible. You just made the connection. It's a good one. I mean, that's something I thought of, but could be. I mean, it's typically described as not so much where the Chazan is standing, where the Chazan is not standing. I mean, don't read it from the place where we usually daven. Read it from the place where we read the Torah, or in this case, recite the Psalms, because Kabbalat Shabbat, like Hallel, like Sukkot and Zimra, is fundamentally Psalms, except for one song that we sing, L'cha Dodi, very beloved song, which we'll get to hopefully next week. It's a song which people have written about with all kinds of mystical references, but outside of the song, it's fundamentally recitation of verses from the Bible. So to that extent, it's very similar to Torah reading. I mean, maybe that's part of it. I like what you said in terms of the idea of accepting, but I'm not sure that was the reason of those who. It was more where you can't be. I think it was more not we daven, because it's all new, and as we know, new things. But of course, this was hundreds of years ago, and since that time, except in many synagogues they still have that practice. They probably don't even know why, but I mean, initially that was the reason. Okay, so now let us take a look at. We'll start with I want to start with this custom, which is more widespread than I thought, in the Adot Mizrach, which is to read the six consecutive Psalms, Psalm 95 through 100 inclusive. And I find this to be, and I've come across this in various Sidurim lately. I had no idea until a few years ago. But there's something about this that I think is extremely interesting and useful for us to think about. And that is, if you look at Psalm, and I actually saw that the fellow named Elchanan Samet, who's done a lot of work on Psalms, made this point. And it's a good point. I want to take it a little different direction, but it's an important point. What he noticed was the following. Let's think about Psalm 95 through 100. So, I mean, these are the Psalm 95 through 100. What he noticed is the following. If you look at Psalm 96, it begins with Shibur Lashem Shir Chadash. That's how Psalm 96 begins. Sing a new song unto God. Shibur Lashem Kol Haaretz. That's 96. If you look at Psalm 97, it says, Hashem Malach Tagel Haaretz. Yismechu Iyim Rabim. So God reigns, God is king. Let the islands, the many islands rejoice. Okay? Hashem Malach Tagel Haaretz. Psalm 98, Mizmar, Shiru Lashem Shir Chadash. So Psalm 98 begins identically to Psalm 96. So 96 and 98 begin the same way. Shiru Lashem Shir Chadash. Sing a new song to God. Then you get to Psalm 99, Hashem Malach Yegrezu Amim. Yoshev Kruvim Tanu Ta'aretz. Psalm 99 begins with Hashem Malach, which is the same as Psalm 97. So 96 and 98 start the same way. 97 and 99 start the same way. And now, if we go back to right? Psalm 95, what we notice is that Psalm 100 is very similar to Psalm 95. Psalm 100, Mizmor L'Todah, Hariu Hashem Kol Haaretz, Ivdu Et Hashem B'Simcha, Bo Lifanav Birnana, and then other connections as well. 100 is a shorter psalm, Mizmor L'Todah, which many of us may be familiar with from the daily prayer service, and it's very strikingly similar to Psalm 95. So 95 is similar to 100, 96 is similar to 98, and 97 is similar to 99, which suggests, to me in any event, that the Kabbalists, those of whom said read these 6 Psalms, were not just picking 6 arbitrary Psalms. They were picking a set of Psalms that are internally connected to each other. The same way the last 6 Psalms of the book of Psalms all end with the word Hallelujah. They saw that as a group of Psalms. They saw the Hallel as a group of Psalms related to each other that I've spoken about in the past. And now we have these 6 Psalms, which also can be seen as a group. It wasn't an arbitrary selection. These 6 Psalms actually are a group of Psalms. Now, if you ask the question, how come that this practice of reading these 6 Psalms, which apparently does exist in the Sephardic world, how come that we don't say Psalm 100? We say 95 through 99 and not Psalm 100. That can be explained in many ways, but one of them is very simply that according to many, Psalm 100 is not an appropriate psalm to say on Shabbat. On the Sabbath, we don't say Mizmor L'Todah. We don't say it in Psukei D'Zimra. We say it every day of the week, except Shabbat. The reason that's given by the Ashkenazim is that Mizmor L'Todah, a song of praise, was taken by many to mean Mizmor L'Todah, a song that would be sung when the Todah offering was brought. There's a sacrifice in the Torah called Korban Todah, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, Mizmor L'Todah, and that was not brought on Shabbat because the Todah sacrifice is not a communal sacrifice, it's a personal sacrifice. And on the Holy Shabbat, we never bring personal sacrifices. We're not allowed to. It's a desecration of the Shabbat. There is a license given to bring the communal sacrifices on Shabbat, even extra sacrifices, but no license to bring the personal sacrifices. So since Mizmor L'Todah was understood as a personal sacrifice, it was not brought on Shabbat, and hence we didn't recite this particular psalm on the Shabbat. So this was taken out, and perhaps in its place is Psalm 29, Mizmor L'David Havu Hashem B'nei Elim. But apparently many of the Sfardim didn't have that problem with it. First of all, they may not have understood Mizmor L'Todah as referring to the Todah sacrifice. Maybe it's a praise of thanksgiving, or maybe the word Todah doesn't mean thanksgiving altogether. Maybe the word Todah sometimes can mean just praise. So the 6 of them, certainly, it's interesting, the 6 of these Psalms certainly fit together. There's one group of Psalms, Mizmor L'Todah. Let me just digress for one moment. Since I'm talking about a practice of the Sephardic Jews to recite the 6 Psalms, I want to mention another practice of the Sephardic Jews and the Hasidic Jews, who daven Nusach Sfard. Because Nusach Sfard is actually Ashkenazim who daven, who their davening has some elements of the Sephardic davening. It's not they don't misrach. It's a Hasidic davening Nusach Sfard. The practice of Nusach Sfard, I don't know if any of you out there daven Nusach Sfard, but the mincha before Shabbat, the mincha prayer before Shabbat, what do they be? Mincha always starts with Psalm 145 with Ashrei. Ashrei Tzilol David. But on Erev Shabbat, the Hasidim say an additional psalm. Does anybody know what psalm the Hasidim say Erev Shabbat? Very beautiful psalm, actually. Yes, Ilana Rubin, correct. Psalm 107. That is correct. Do you daven Nusach Sfardi, or you just happen to know it? But it is true. Now, Psalm 107 is a very striking psalm. Chabad, yes, good. Psalm 107, that's Nusach Sfardi. Nusach Chabad, but it's also Nusach Sfardi. So now Psalm 107 is a very striking psalm. Psalm 107, which is a very beautiful psalm. Hodu Hashem ki tov ki v'yolam chasto. And what is Psalm 107? So Psalm 107 is a description of different people who are in dire straits and were rescued. For example, somebody who took a dangerous journey, and finally came out safely. A dangerous journey and was safe. Another example, somebody was imprisoned. And came out of jail. The people who travel on the boats, whatever it is, that's dangerous. A dangerous trip, a dangerous journey, prison. The Talmud says, Arba tzrichim lahodot. There are four kinds of people who have to give thanks. And we have that practice, actually. We have exactly this practice, that if somebody was very sick, for example, it's a good example. Somebody recovers from a serious illness. Somebody was in danger in some sort, physical danger. Somebody took a dangerous trip. In my days, when somebody took a trip someplace and flew, when they came back, they would come back to the synagogue and make a blessing called Birkata Gomel. Birkata Gomel is based on this chapter, actually. Arba tzrichim lahodot, but some understood that to mean these are the people that have to bring a sacrifice, a todo sacrifice. So it is very striking that there's a practice among the Hasidic Jews that before Shabbat begins, to read the psalm, which is all about giving thanks. Because on Shabbat itself, we're not going to talk about the Todah on Shabbat. But we do want to recognize that Shabbat can be understood as a safe haven. That the week can be construed as a place of difficulty, a place of struggle. And when the Shabbat comes, we feel happy that Shabbat is here. We can at least for one day forget our problems or try to forget them. There's a kind of tranquility, a serenity to the Shabbat. And that's the very beautiful practice to recite Psalm 107 before Shabbat. It's a Hasidic practice. It's Nusach Sfard. It's a really beautiful psalm, Psalm 107. So Mizmor Todah, that the Ashkenazim do not say. I don't think the Hasidim say it either, but the Todah Psalm 107 is recited before the Shabbat. Okay, now let us begin to look at these psalms, which the section of our prayer service we call Kabbalat Shabbat. And let's begin with Psalm number 95. Psalm 95. And what's interesting about L'chuda Radada, there's several interesting features, but I wanted to point out one fascinating feature of this psalm. This is the psalm that was chosen. This is a choice they made to have this service beginning with Psalm number 95. Psalm 95 is actually a strange psalm. And certainly it would not have been my pick. I got to tell you that. Because Psalm 95 has two parts. The first part of Psalm 95, let's sing joyously to God. Let us shout out for the rock who is our Savior, our deliverer. Okay, I got that. And then the Kanma Fanav B'Todah. Let us come into God's presence. Again, the word Todah. They translate in this translation as praise. Could also be thanksgiving. There's Mirot Narielo with song. It talks about song, right? Psuke de Zimra are called verses of song, of Zimra. These verses also are verses of song because God is great. El Gadol Hashem, come back to this. Umelech Gadol al Kol Elohim. God is the great king of all divine beings. God is the depths of the ocean, Mechtrei Aretz, and the peaks of the mountain are God's. The Yam, the sea is God's. God made the sea, and God formed the land, Yabeshet, and the dry land, Yadav Yatzaru. This God is God of creation, the most powerful of all gods, to whom we sing. Let us bow down, prostrate ourselves, kneel before the God who made us, for He is our God. We are His flock, right? And then the last half of verse number 7, Hayom in Bekolo Tishmo, if you would heed God's charge. So that already, if you would heed God's charge, is qualifier. It's hard to know whether that's someone's telling us, be careful, heed God's charge, or does it mean if you only would heed God's charge, suggesting that we're not heeding God's charge. And that's the second half of verse number 7. And then you read the last four verses of the psalm that we begin the Shabbat with. Al takshu levavchem kim riva, kiyom masa bamidbar. Don't harden your heart as you did in Meriva, as you did in the place called Masa in the desert. There's a story, actually 2 stories in the Torah of Masa and Meriva. I'll get back to this. Don't behave as you did in Masa and Meriva. Asher nisunu avotechem, where your ancestors tested me. Bichanuni, they tested me. Gamro, following, even though they had seen my deeds. Nonetheless, they tested me. People of little faith. And therefore, Arba'im Shana al Kut Bedar, and I quarreled with these people. I was provoked by them for 40 years. Volmar, I said, Am Toei Levav Haim, Behem Lo Yadu Derachai. These people, Toei Levav, senseless people, mistaken people, who know not my ways. And therefore, Hashem Nishbati BIP, and in my anger I swore, Im Yevo'un El Menuchati, they will never come to my resting place. I got to tell you, this is not the way I would end the first psalm upon accepting the Shabbat. These are words of condemnation. Don't be like them. Hayomim b'kol tishma. If you listen, obey. And if you don't, if you are like your ancestors who misbehaved in Masa and in Meriva, and they never arrived at their destination. They wandered about for 40 years. And not only that, I swore in my great anger, says God, they will never find Menuchati, my resting place, my holy land. This is the choice. I didn't choose it. The Kabbalists chose this to begin our introduction to the Shabbat. So I want to, this bothered me for years, by the way, I got to tell you. And I have a thought about this particular psalm. And my thought is the following. My thought is that, given what I said earlier, that these 6 psalms, counting Psalm 100, are all linked together. It's not, you're not reading just Psalm 95. You're reading 95, let's say, through 100. It strikes me that if you stop at this point, it doesn't sound too good. I mean, this is not the way we want to start Shabbos. But you don't stop because Psalm 95 is connected to what we read later. And my suggestion is the following, that Psalm 95 is connected, is 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, let's say 100. And my suggestion is that Psalm 95 has to be read in conjunction with both the end of Psalm 99, 99b, and little Psalm 100. So if we jump ahead for a moment to Psalm 99, And I have a couple of things to say about this, but Psalm 99 begins with God is enthroned on the Kruvim, right? And then God is a king. These Psalms talk about God's kingship. God is a king who loves justice, mishpat, tzedakah, etc. Exalt this God, bow down to God's footstool, for God is holy. That is chapter 99, verse number 5. And then, all of a sudden, something that appears to be out of the blue. Moshe v'Aaron b'choanav u'Shmuel b'korei shemo. Korim al Hashem v'hu yanem. B'yamud anan yedaber alehem. Shamru eidotav v'chok natan lamo. Hashem Elokeinu ata anitam. El nosei hayito lahem v'nokem al alilotam. Lo Hashem Elokeinu v'ishtachavu v'harkodsho ki kadosh Hashem Elokeinu. So it strikes me that if you read this, what is it? Moses and Aaron among his priests, his servants, and Samuel, those that summon God's name, call upon God's name, cry out to God, and God answers them. God speaks to them in a pillar of cloud. They obeyed Shamru Eidotav, they obeyed God's decrees, and they obeyed the law that God gave them. And then we say, oh God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God. You did exact retribution for the misdeeds, but you are a forgiving God. And therefore exalt the Lord our God and bow down. Our Lord our God is holy. And what strikes me is that this last section, which seems to come out of nowhere, is a very wonderful response to what we read in Psalm 95. Psalm 95, part B. So 95 is two parts. Part B is...
I just want to give you that 10-minute warning.
Okay, Psalm 95b speaks about Masa Umariva. When you think about Masa Umariva, the story of Masa Umariva appears twice in the Torah. It appears in the book of Exodus. It appears in the book of Bamidbar. Masa and Mariva is the place where Moses hits the rock, actually. And God says to Moshe and Aaron in that you're not going to enter the land. That's what it says in the book of Bamidbar. But in the book of Shemot, there's also a story of Masa Umariva in chapter 17. And there's no mention whatsoever of Moshe doing the wrong thing. He hits the rock, supposed to hit the rock. And God responds to Moshe, and what water flows from the rock, and the people are able to move on in the desert. They're in the desert, they have no water, can't live without water. And that's chapter 17. And there they are condemned for their questioning of God, their testing of God, they're condemned. But Moshe, who is the main player over there, is the leader, and God responds. And the book of Exodus goes on to speak of God giving us the Torah, and then God allowing us, instructing us how to build the Mishkan. And it strikes me that's precisely the second half of Psalm 99. It speaks of Moses and Aaron and Samuel, those that cry out to God, and God responds. And God responds in the cloud. The same way God appears in the Mishkan, which is the culmination of the book of Exodus. And you are a forgiving God. Yes, you exact retribution. As God said, God made us wander for 40 years. That's Psalm 95. But in Psalm 99, it's responding to the second part of Psalm 95, and it speaks of a forgiving God and God who allows us to find our place. Our place in the book of Exodus is, of course, the temple. And what strikes me is that these two Psalms should be read together, and that implicitly, because this was chosen for Kabbalat Shabbat, so what's implicit in these Psalms, maybe what the Kabbalists had in mind, is a parallel between discovering God's space, whether it's the Holy Land, or whether it's the temple on one hand, and discovery of sacred time, which is the Shabbat. The word menucha is very striking. That's the way the first Psalm ended. Shen nishbati biapi im yivaul el menuchati. if they will come to Menucha, which in the Torah means the land of serenity. El HaMenucha v'el HaNachala. But in the context of choosing this for the Shabbat, the idea of Menucha has a different meaning, which is the day of rest, which is the holy day, which is the Shabbat. And what strikes me as very interesting is that if Psalm 95b relates to Psalm 95b, then Psalm 100, Mizmor LaTodah, is directly related, of course, to 95a. When you look at Psalm 100, the language of Mizmor LaTodah and the language of the first half of L'chuna Rana are very similar to each other. Look at the language. You have, for example, Hariu Hashem Kol Haaretz, Ivdu et Hashem B'Simcha, Bo Lefanav Birnana. You have Rinana. We have L'chuna Rana Hashem, Noriya L'tzur Yishenu. That's parallel. Then you have in verse number 3, know that Hashem is God. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu amo v'tzon marito. Psalm 100, verse number 3. And when you go back to Psalm 95, you have the expression there. Where is that? Verse number 7. Kihu Eloheinu v'anachnu am mariso v'tzon yado. Identical expression. So you have the idea of the Todah, right? You have in L'chuna Rana, in Psalm 95, Nekadma Panav B'Todah, Psalm 95, verse number 2. And over here we have Mizmor LaTodah, right? That's how it begins, right? So the point is, what's striking to me is that Psalm 100 is parallels, very similar to the first part of Psalm 95. And at the end of Psalm 99 is a direct response to Masa Umriva of Psalm 95. Masa Umriva says, God was angry, you tested me, you're going to wander for 40 years. And then in Psalm 99, Moshe v'Aaron b'choanav u'shmuel b'karei shemo. So there's always the opportunity to cry out to God, to call out to God. And the God is a forgiving God. That was one thought I had about the relationship of these. But the Psalms are a group of Psalms that speak to each other, the 6 Psalms, and they were chosen by the Kabbalists to be parallel to the 6 Psalms of Psukkah de Zimra and the 6 Psalms of Hallel. Now let me just stop one moment let me just make one more comment over here, and then I'll take comments or questions. Something else struck me very interesting about the choice of this Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat, let's think of it as an additional service. I'm not going to get into the technical side. Technically, it's not a service, but de facto, it is a service. It's the service we call Kabbalat Shabbat. And what struck me was this, that in Psalm 95, that it speaks of, let's sing out to God, the God who is Yish'enu, the God who is our Redeemer. Noriya L'tzur Yish'enu. If you think about the way we begin the normal prayer service, is what we call the Amidah. The first blessing of the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei, Melech Ozer U'Moshia U'Magen, speaks of a God who was a protector, and who was a Moshiach, who was a deliverer. And the God of the first blessing of our daily prayers, the first blessing, in that first section, description of God, the key word is Gadol. Hail HaGadol HaGibar v'Hanorah, which of course, that's Abraham's description. That's how we start our prayers, Gadol. And over here in Psalm 95, Kiel Gadol Hashem, Umelech Gadol Akol Elohim. And in the first blessing of the Amidah, unlike most of the other blessings, but in the first blessing, we actually bow, right? We bow down. Over here, Bo nishtachaveh v'nichra nivracha l'fnei Hashem osenu. So it's striking. You have the idea of the bowing, you have the Gadol, you have the Moshiach, right? And that is the first blessing of the Amidah. So perhaps they had in mind that this new service that they invented, it's an invention, it's a Kabbalistic invention, and it begins with the first blessing of the Amidah. That first section, description of God. These Psalms are descriptions of God, and the focus here is God is Gadol. God is great. El Gadol Hashem Umelech Gadol al Kol Elohim. What is the description of God in Psalm 99? In Psalm 99, different description. The description of God, 99:8, right? The description of God is verse number 3, Yodoshimcha Gadol v'Norah Kadoshu. God is not just Gadol, but Norah v'Kadosh, which of course is the third blessing. Baruch atah Hashem el HaKadosh, Rosh Hashanah Norah v'Kadosh atah. And then the last verse of Psalm 99, Romu Hashem Elokeinu, v'shtachavu l'har kadsho, ki kadosh Hashem Elokeinu. So the God of Psalm 99 is not just Gadol, that's the God of 95. But the God of Psalm 99 is not just Gadol, but Norah, and especially Kadosh. So Kadosh in verse number 3, Kadosh in verse number 5, and Kadosh once again in verse number 9. Triple Kadosh. And I'm wondering whether in creating a new service, actually, it's new. And this is something to think about. I think this is a very deep point about the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists did do some new things, but they wanted to root what they did in the classical prayer. So the classical prayer, these are psalms of praise, and they root that in the Hallel, and they root that in Psukei Zimra, and they root the descriptions of God, beginning and end, in the first blessing of the Amidah, and in the third blessing, the last blessing of that first section of the Amidah. The first one is Gadol, and the third one is Kadosh. It's something to think about when thinking about the Kabbalistic additions to the prayer service. Even the Kabbalat Shabbat in general predates the Kabbalists, but of course they blew it all up. They amplified it, they embellished it, etc. But the core idea of accepting the Shabbat was that existed hundreds of years before the Kabbalists of Tzfat. Okay, I'll stop at this point. Are there any comments or questions? Next week we'll say a few more things about Psukei Zimra, then we'll turn our attention to Lucha Dodi, which is very interesting. Beloved song.
Would you comment on Ushmuel Mikarei Shemo? Why was that added there?
It's a very good question. Of course, Shmuel is not the only place Shmuel in the Tanakh is built upon Moshe. So it's, this is a good example of where, another example of where Shmuel has represented, his whole story is based on Moshe. Not that he's identical to, but based upon Moshe. There's another verse also. Im Yavo Moshe Esav Shmuel, even if Moses would come before me with Samuel, I wouldn't listen. But your question is still a very good one. I don't know why Dafka over here is it brought in. Why Shmuel brought in him? Because if we talk about Maso Mariba, we don't need Shmuel, because that's Moshe and Aaron. So why is he? I have to think about that, Chaim. It's a good question. I don't know. That's a very good question about what.
Shmuel asked something about Shem. Shmuel asked that it rain in the summertime. He asked something very unusual. Hashem and Hashem answered him to prove a point about the kingship.
True. That is very true. That Shmuel, had God perform. It's a good point. Maybe there's an idea that Shmuel is one who he had his own purposes for it, but Shmuel is somebody who cried out to God under extremely unusual circumstances, and God, when I say performed a miracle and responded. Could be that's it. Something about Shmuel's prayer, which is very striking. Korev el Hashem b'hu name, that the claim that's being made is that God will answer prayers of the righteous, even prayers that are, one might say, not. The response will not be expected because it violates the laws of nature. Perhaps, I don't know. It's I'll think about it. Thank you for that. I'll think about it as well. Okay, so we'll stop then here at this point, and next week we will look at Lucha Dodi, and we'll proceed. The key is to try to find the pieces of the Shabbat service that are unique to Shabbat and different. If we were all sitting together in a room, then we would do some singing also, I think would be very good. But with Zoom, it's very difficult. But because the singing, especially Kabbalat Shabbat, the singing adds a lot to the Nusach and the Chadodi. It really brings out a lot of the meaning, I think, and the power of this particular service, which is, I think, Jewish people love Kabbalat Shabbat. It's a beautiful service. Okay, we'll stop at this point and look forward to continue with you next week. Yes, Kayla, you want to add something?
Nope. Thank you everyone for joining this morning. And if you would like to join us for more Fallsmon classes with Rabbi Silber and a range of other teachers, you can find out more at grisha.org/classes.
There's another class that comes right up now, right?
The next class will be starting at 1 p.m. with Dr. Dorabandi.